Thank you, Minister, for your opening address. I now invite Mr. Baijayant Panda, Member of Parliament for Lok Sabha, Republic of India, to give his keynote address.
Honorable Minister, Mr. Kiat, Ambassador Pillai, High Commissioner of India, Dr. Subbarao, Mr. Rai, Mr. Chua, Professor Bardhan, Professor Mitra, distinguished delegates, it's a real privilege and a pleasure for me to have the opportunity to speak at the 10th Annual ISAS Conference to this very, very distinguished audience. I was very impressed by Ambassador Pillai's reference to the history of the Kalinga Empire, from whose modern-day version, Odisha, I come from. And I wanted to add a line to that story, which is true, by the way. The party which I represent in Parliament is named after the late Biju Patnaik. It has his name in the party. He was indeed a fighter pilot before he became a politician, and that story is true. Just as a corollary to that, I thought I should share with you when President Megawati visited India some years ago, and I had the opportunity to meet her and her family. I was indeed taken aback to find that her daughter is named Orissa Putri, to continue that tradition forward. Now, since the topic of today's discussion involves a lot of politics, I cannot but resist sharing with you one of my favorite anecdotes about politics. This was said by the late American humorist Bob Hope, who said, "No one political party can fool all the people all the time, which is why we have two." Now, in India, of course, we have a much bigger burden with a population of 1.27 billion, which is why, in its wisdom, our electorate has chosen to have 40 political parties to carry on that responsibility. Of course, this doesn't apply to my friend, the Honorable Finance Minister's party, or to my party. I thought I should make that clear. In talking about the issue of land, obviously, will speak almost entirely about India. And thank you, Ambassador Pillai, for setting that context. I don't have the expertise to speak about other South Asian countries and their situations, although I might mention it in passing. Of course, lack of expertise never stopped any politician from speaking on a subject. But considering that there are so many real experts in the audience, I thought I should be a little bit more circumspect. Now, I presume many people are familiar with the drama we've had in India over land acquisition, but I'm going to talk to you a little bit and bring you up to date in case you haven't followed that. It's quite a big drama that's been going on. In 2013, Parliament passed unanimously the Land Acquisition Act, which is referred to in the note prepared by ISAS, to overturn a late 19th century eminent domain act from the British Raj days. And although this was passed unanimously, within 13 months, new government and a new parliament tried to amend it. And as some of you must undoubtedly be familiar, this has been seen to be the present government's biggest setback, in the sense that not only could it not get passed, but the short-term executive ordinances that this government passed a couple of times had to lapse, and the latest is that the government has no longer issued another ordinance. There is more to be said about this. I'll mention this as I go along. But for all practical purposes, the issue of any amendment to the Land Acquisition and Rehabilitation Act, Resettlement Act, is now going to be left to the states. That's not necessarily a bad thing at all, but let me share with you the background about how this evolved. And I will share anecdotes as I go along from behind the scenes. Now, when the Land Acquisition Act, Land Acquisition, Rehabilitation and Resettlement Act of 2013 was passed unanimously, as I said, irrespective of what was admitted publicly, it was clear to many of us in Parliament that this was unworkable. Now, this had been said by some commentators, but more important is that many of us inside Parliament were quite clear that this was not practical, it was not going to work. Without giving a name, let me cite a very senior member of the present government, who was in the opposition then, who told me quite categorically in private that we have no option but to vote for this because elections are coming and this is a populist-sounding bill. We cannot be seen to be opposing it. But it's not going to work. And he wasn't the only one, and he wasn't the only party. In the last few weeks of the 2013 bill being passed by Parliament, there was a rush all across India by state governments to expedite land acquisition wherever it was going on or wherever it was held up, because it was equally clear to state administrations that the new act would be supremely complicated, would be extremely difficult to implement. My own state, in fact, has had a lot of complicated land issues. In case some of you don't make the connection, we've had these major disputes of land concerning very large investment projects, such as the Pohang Steel Project in Odisha, POSCO, such as the Vedanta Alumina Refinery, also in Odisha, such as the Vedanta University in Odisha, and I can give you a couple of other examples. I'll actually cite some details of examples as I go along. Not just my state, but many states governed by different political parties, governed by the Congress, governed by the BJP, governed by other regional parties like mine, which is called the Biju Janata Dal, embarked on this rush to acquire whatever land they could in the last few weeks. It also became subsequently clear, after the act was passed, that it was not going to work. In fact, not much acquisition happened. There is a turnaround to that story. There was a reference by Ambassador Pillai to Chief Minister Naidu's efforts on creating a land bank. I'll refer to other efforts that are going on across the country in creating land banks. So it's not such a negative story, but it quite clearly, almost no land acquisition happened for quite some time after that bill was passed. Now, the skepticism about rehabilitation and resettlement in India is real. So in case, as some people have commented, you think that this is just cynical politics. There is a lot of cynical politics in it, but it is not just cynical politics. So in case anybody thinks that, I want to make it clear that there is a real concern among many, even those of us, I, for instance, clearly am in support of modernizing our laws so that hurdles and bottlenecks such as land, labor, the fiscal regime need to be reformed. But even I would concede that there were genuine issues with the old Land Act from the late 19th century, and I'll cite a couple of examples that did need to be attended. Now, eminent domain as a concept is today getting questioned in India. And the reason for that is that that Land Act which we inherited from before independence was abused quite a lot. How was it abused? Now, if you, again, I'll cite examples I'm most familiar with. So in Odisha, in the 1950s, when major public sector undertakings were being constructed, the so-called temples of modern India that Pandit Nehru used to talk about, two examples are the Rourkela steel plant, which has created an entire new city and local economy, and the Hirakud Dam. Both of these involved large land acquisition from local populations, including from indigenous populations, tribals or Adivasis as we call them. And I think it is sad that even today, nearly 70 years on, there are still disputes pending in the courts from compensation issues, for identifying who the people were who were displaced, and so on and so forth. there are large numbers of people who did not get compensated or did not get compensated properly or did not get jobs that they were promised. This is for the public sector. This is for something that government did. So you can well imagine the excesses and the abuses that might have happened among others. Now, the point I'm making is that the cynicism and the skepticism about losing land is genuine. There's a real reason that it has happened. And so we need to address that. The issue of equity, which the Honorable Minister was talking about, is extremely important. The one side of the coin is the bottlenecks of land and the other regulatory bottlenecks that need to be changed and removed. The other side of the coin is that none of this change is going to be sustainable unless you have the support of the broadest range of people behind you. But what does the broadest range of people mean? So when the Land Act was being discussed, one of the issues was, I'm talking about the 2013 Land Act, obviously, also last year and this year when we were debating this in Parliament. The two biggest concerns, there are many aspects of any Land Act. The two biggest issues are the issue of consent of the people being displaced and the issue of compensation of what they get. Now, there are many other aspects, but these two are the biggest ones. So what does consent mean? Now, the skepticism that I was talking about had gone to such a level that people were trying to define consent as getting every last individual to agree. I'll give you an example. So when a project like POSCO or a project like Vedanta acquires large tracts of land, between 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 acres of land, they have to deal with dozens of villages and hundreds and sometimes thousands, very rarely tens of thousands, of people that would be displaced. So we had also, in the meantime, over the past many decades, come up with several other types of legislation which overlap land law. So you have mineral laws impacting those areas of land acquisition where minerals are present. You have forest laws and environmental laws for those areas where you have forest and environment. You have the rights of what we call forest dwellers or Adivasis or tribals. And in many of these laws, you require the consent of the local panchayat, which is a village or a group of villages, for that land to be acquired. Now, in practical terms, what this meant was that if you're acquiring something like 3,000 acres, and that involves, let us say, something like 70 or 80 panchayats spread out, does every village have a veto? It's an important question. And many people, particularly on the left, were arguing that yes, not only every village, but every individual ought to have a veto. Now, that's not practical. We all know that. So, what is practical? In that discussion, the government of India set up what was called an empowered group of ministers. Now, governments are very fond of using euphemisms like this. It turned out that the empowered group of ministers was not empowered at all. The empowered group of ministers held meetings, which are sub-cabinet committee meetings, and recommended that if 60% of the people of the people to be displaced agree to a compensation scheme and a rehabilitation scheme, then the rest 40% would have no option. Now, this became debated in public, and as I said, the empowered group of ministers' recommendations was thrown out, and the government, what ultimately passed was that it had to be 70% if it was for public purpose, and 80% of the people consenting if it was to be for private purpose or commercial purpose. But what is public purpose? And the ridiculous lengths to which we went to discuss and describe public purpose is illustrative. We've gone to the extent of discussing such issues as it's only public purpose if it's a linear project, i.e. railway tracks, canals. But it's not public purpose if it is a rectangle. The reason being that rectangular or square or large plots of land is usually meant for something that has a much more commercial connotation. Industrial plant, perhaps, or something else. Now, do you think that linear projects are clearly public purpose? One would imagine that, for example, railways are public purpose. Let me give you an example. Now, in my constituency, although it is near the capital of the state, and indeed the state has been turning around, as I mentioned to the Honorable Minister, which he was kind enough to mention, we have just become an international airport, a couple of connecting flights. We are looking at connecting to Singapore in the near future. My constituency is a couple of hours away from the capital, happens not to have any railway line. It's a little oddity. Now, we've been working on a project which has been on the anvil for about 35 years now, to build about 90 kilometers of railway line to go through my constituency. Should be clearly considered as public purpose, of course. But it turns out, when I became the MP in 2009, prior to which I was in the upper house, but in 2009 and 2014, the people of Kendrapara were kind enough to elect me. And in looking into the issues of the constituency, I found that one of the hurdles that they faced was that some land was yet to be acquired because of the following. Now, this project in today's money is somewhere between $250 and $300 million. And the land that had been acquired, very willingly the people had agreed, had been acquired at differential prices depending on whether it was government land or private land. Now, sometimes this happens where the government gives a little higher compensation to private land just to sweeten the deal. In this particular case, it had been the other way around. Very odd, because no private person is going to accept compensation less for his or her land when the adjoining government land is being bought at a higher price. Logical. But some too smart for his own good government officer had done exactly that. And obviously, thousands of people were objecting, and I thought they were right to object. So I inquired further, and there was a proposal to make up that difference. And that difference in today's money was coming to a little less than $10 million. And I said, look, here you've got a project of nearly $300 million stuck. The interest cost alone for the months of delay would make it logical that if it's $8 or $9 million, you should settle it. And for the correct principle. They're not being obdurate, they're demanding their rights. It took me 4 years to run around in circles at the central government, at the state government, with the railways ministry, with the other authorities to get that approved, just for justice to be done. But I can give you many other examples of how these projects are stuck simply because of legacy issues of compensation and acquisition being handled badly, leading to an entrenched suspicion, leading to an entrenched resistance to land being acquired. In recent years, a lot of land was acquired for what was supposed to be SEZs, special economic zones, special export zones, and most of them didn't take off. And a lot of them were acquired in manner that was controversial, and some of those controversies are still continuing. And some of the allegations made against these projects were that the promoters of these projects were making a real estate play and not really a play for export zones. And if you're going to make a real estate play, you ought to be playing by real estate rules. And that's a whole different ballgame, which I will mention a little bit later. We've had many other kinds of abuse of the system and confusion about what constitutes public purpose, what doesn't constitute public purpose, and what ought to be the rules of the game. I write a monthly op-ed column in the Times of India, which is the largest circulated English newspaper in India, probably in the world actually. And in March, I wrote a column about land acquisition and the political deadlock that we were already in. And the newspaper chose to title it A Greek Tragedy. And indeed, that's what it has become. Although I am not as pessimistic as some of the things I'm saying might sound. I'm optimistic, and I will conclude with more information on that. But the point that we have come to is that if I ask some of my colleagues who are against any amendment to the land bill, you know the land bill has been shelved, but let me tell you this. When I was one of the people trying to find solutions, and I'd ask some of my colleagues opposing this. They were rigid about consent, because the new proposed amendments last year and this year diluted some of the consent clauses. It did not dilute the compensation clauses, although there was a canard spread that the new amendment dilutes the compensation clause as well, which created a whole new resistance and took several months to clarify. But to come back to consent, I would ask some of my colleagues, all right, let's start from the extremes. Do you think there is any circumstance where no consent should be required? And they'd go, no, but it's unfair and this and that. I said, yes, I understand. But is there any purpose? For example, the Prime Minister argued in Parliament that for defense installations, no consent should be required. Do you agree that at least for linear projects like railways or canals, which do not take up a lot of your agricultural land, there should be no consent? The opponents of a modern land acquisition law would not commit to even that. Now, that's an extreme that we can't live with. If you take the argument that there has to be consent for any and every instance, irrespective of public purpose, it's not a functional government. Nobody is clearly saying that, but if you try to pin them down to even the very extreme condition of a very limited definition of extreme public purpose, where no consent should be required, you cannot get any of the opponents of a reformed land law to agree to even one narrow specific. And that's not workable. So in my column in March, I had researched the issue, and I took very opposite extremes. I took the extreme of the US, the largest capitalist economy in the world, and I took the opposite extreme example of China, the second largest capitalist economy of the world. Sorry, that was just a minor allusion. Now, to the best of my knowledge, neither of the two countries provides a veto to landowners for acquisition of land for public purpose. In fact, no country can do that. I'm not familiar with the situation in Singapore, but I would imagine that for certain specifically defined public purpose, a veto cannot be given to the landowners. In the US, indeed, they go a little further, that even land acquisition by private entities in certain cases can and have been defined as public purpose. China, of course, has different conditions, but India's definition of public purpose, even the very strict and narrow definition of public purpose, such as linear projects, in my opinion, ought to have very minimal consent requirements as long as you are very clear that the compensation is properly taken care of. Again, when I talk to you about the ludicrousness of some of these objections, do keep in mind that it is justified by past efforts, by past history. So, for example, some of you might remember a major controversy over a village called Nandigram in West Bengal. And it led to a lot of political agitation. This was about 7 years ago, I think, 6 or 7 years ago. And I had been part of a group of MPs, including Shri Advani and Srimati Sushma Swaraj, who is today the foreign minister. And we went and found something quite stunning. We found that the acquisition of the land, which was being done with government support and acquiescence, was blatantly being misrepresented. So one of the conditions of deciding compensation is obviously to figure out what the landowner is losing. So when it comes to agricultural land, one of the key factors is it fallow land? Is it single crop land? Is it multi-crop land? Something which is a multi-crop land, which has 2 or 3 crops in a year, which grows not just the basic grains like rice or wheat, but also grains, does cropping of vegetables and maybe, as I said, multi-crop, is valued differently. Thousands of acres of multi-crop land were being sought to be represented as single crop land in order that the compensation would be less. 7 years ago. Now, I suppose in the late 19th century or early 20th century, you could get away with some of this. Today, it's not possible. It is not possible in this era of 800 television channels covering India, in this era when internet has crossed 250 million users and rapidly growing. It is not possible that you can get away by this kind of mass misrepresentation. That has to be corrected. And until and unless we put a complete, full and hard stop to such misrepresentation, we are going to have that knee-jerk resistance to even that extreme example that nothing can be defined as public purpose. So we need to start addressing some of these very fundamental and long-entrenched problems before we can hope to get the majority of the people behind us in any new reformed Land Act. Land in urban areas, of course, is a completely different story because the real estate sector, arguably, is the single biggest source of corruption in India. Now that takes some doing. For any one sector to have that kind of a reputation where corruption is fairly endemic takes some doing. The kind of manipulations that take place, you don't need me to spell it out for you, manipulations in floor area ratio, manipulations in zoning, the dozens of inspections and construction permits that anybody requires, make it impossible, virtually impossible, for anybody to be operating in the real estate sector and abiding by all the rules. A lot of vested political interest in that, and whereas the large land tracts that we seek to acquire in rural or semi-rural areas for major economic development have to do with votes, urban land has to do with money, and I mean political money, because of the non-transparent manner that funding and transactions have taken over the real estate sector. I'm talking about both housing and commercial real estate in urban India. There are very many vested interests that need to be cracked open before that problem can get sorted. The reality is that about 60% of our population makes a living from farming. This is not sustainable. If you look at large modern countries, they're all down in the single digits. And even in India, the problem is that farm holdings are getting ever more fragmented with each passing generation. So scaling and efficiency keep on getting affected. On the one hand, you're improving that with fertilizers, with irrigation, with improvement of weather predictions because monsoon is such a critical factor. And on the other hand, you simply do not have the scale to make farming viable in the long run. And yet, for a large part of the politics and the political dialogue that happens in India, which claims to represent the interest of farmers, actually, if you look closer, is rigid in its outlook that the farmer's land cannot be taken away, but does not deal with the issue of how do you transition hundreds of millions of people dependent on farming into something else. And the reason for that, again, is because of the track record that we've had, and unless you can start putting to rest some of these ghosts from the past, this will continue to be a problem. There's an opportunity here, by the way. The opportunity is that the present generation of children of farmers are not particularly keen to do farming. Now, if you go around Odisha, my state, now Odisha, along with a half a dozen other states, used to be considered basket cases over the past few decades. As I was saying earlier, over the past decade and a half, we have had near double-digit growth, and we have turned around dramatically, although we have a long way to go. And you today see automation coming in, mechanization coming in to farming, even in places like Odisha. And since the young are keen to move on, these are people, we have 1 billion phones in India. So you have farmers' children on WhatsApp, connected to the rest of the world. Hundreds of kilometers and a day or two away from the nearest big city. They don't want to be in farming. They want to look for other opportunities. And while we are trying to get those other opportunities to them, we have to also break the rigidities of land acquisition and the politics concerning how this is to be done. Now, of course, I'm already being shown that we're running out of time, so I'll come to a conclusion. Let me point out that land is not the only bottleneck. Labor laws continue to be a big bottleneck. It's ironic that in a country where we need 1 million jobs to be created every month, and we are creating only about 1 million a year. And that's because most companies would bend over backwards to invest more in mechanization where it is not required, rather than hire a person, because of the headaches of dealing with the employment laws of the country. We also need to unclog fiscal bottlenecks. And if I start talking about GST, which is the other major battle that is taking place in India's parliament, then I think I'll need a whole other day for it. So rather than talk about GST, I will bring my talk to a conclusion with the comment that other South Asian countries are beginning to recognize these realities as well. Recently, the Sri Lankan government has announced a relaxation of land ownership laws. The Maldivian government has recently allowed foreign nationals and foreign entities for the first time to own land in the Maldives. We need to recognize the realities and face up to it. Now, the final thing I want to say is that leaving some of this to the states is not a bad thing. We have for too long had a mindset that we must have a one-size-fits-all central law that applies to all 35 states and union territories. That is not going to work in a large and diverse country. It is no bad thing. And you can see the results of that. Odisha, Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, many states are today putting together land banks with their own local laws. They're proposing new laws and are marketing themselves. And the competition, the cooperative and competitive federalism within India is, in my opinion, a very good thing. I'm optimistic about seeing solutions to most of these in the context of the next, it could be as early as 2 or 3 years, it could be as late as 8 or 9 years. But in the decade ahead, I remain very optimistic. Thank you.